Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming to Utah's state capitol today. In just a moment, Utah Attorney General Sean D. Reyes will be outlining the case and the charges against Mr. Paul D. Peterson related to an illegal adoption scheme that covers multiple states. We want to emphasize that we have a hotline set up to assist anyone who's been affected by these offenses. That information is in your news release, and we will be repeating it several times today, 801-839-5640. Also speaking today will be our Secure Strike Force lead prosecutor, Daniel Strong, and our chief investigator in our investigative division, Leo Lucy. Now, Attorney General Reyes.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. This is a very important news conference where we're announcing charges regarding an illegal adoption scheme involving human smuggling of more than 40 women from the Marshall Islands to the state of Utah. The women were recruited in their home country and offered a significant amount of money to place their babies for adoption here in Utah. This activity violates several Utah laws, including human smuggling, sale of a child, and communications fraud. The commercialization of children is illegal, and the commoditization of children is simply evil. I'm going to say that again. The commoditization of children is simply evil. Last night, Mr. Paul D. Peterson was arrested and charged as the suspected head of this smuggling ring. He also serves as the Maricopa County Assessor in Arizona. Mr. Peterson faces charges in 3 states, including Utah, related to the same illegal scheme. I want to make very clear that we have no interest, none whatsoever, in interfering with any adoption that has already taken place. Protecting the victims, as in all of our cases, is paramount to us. In this case, we have 3 groups of victims: the birth mothers and families, the children, and the adoptive families. We have resources available for all of the victims, and we will continue to provide these resources for all victims throughout this case. Now, I'd like to run through some background information. You'll see it in PowerPoint to give you some context and better understanding of this case and these victims. In October of 2017, the Utah Attorney General's Office Human Trafficking Tip Line, along with tips from the Polaris National Tip Line, began receiving calls about suspicious births and adoptions involving Marshallese women in Utah hospitals. The Utah Attorney General's Office opened an investigation out of its human trafficking unit. Now, we'll see if it's coming back up here. We'll give you a moment because we want you to be able to visualize some of the graphics that are coming up, not necessarily the words that I'm reading. So again, the AGO opened an investigation out of its human trafficking unit in response to those tips. The investigation identified over 40 victims of this scheme in Utah, all from the small nation of the Marshall Islands. A little bit about the Marshall Islands. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is a sovereign nation and a United States associated state. The nation is made up of 29 small atolls with a population of around 55,000. On the global map, just putting it in context, you see a little bit of a trip from the Marshall Islands to Hawaii to Utah. And then you'll see a graphic behind me. We believe that the scope and scale of this operation extends out into many other states that we're aware of, and potentially more states that we're yet to discover. Cultural and economic factors have historically made the Marshallese population uniquely vulnerable to exploitative adoption schemes. The interstate compact between the United States and the Marshall Islands prohibited visa-free travel from the Marshall Islands to the U.S. for the purposes of adoption. Mr. Peterson's illegal adoption scheme violates these immigration restrictions as well as other Utah laws. Now, outreach from Utah to other states led to this becoming a multi-state and eventually an international investigation. And you'll hear a little bit more about the details of how that went forward from our prosecutor, Dan Strong, and from Chief Lucy. The Utah Attorney General's office coordinated its investigation with many law enforcement agencies. These are our partners across several jurisdictions. I want to give credit to them and recognize them. In the state of Utah, in addition to the Utah AGO, we have the Department of Homeland Security, HSI, United States Department of Homeland Security. As well in Arkansas, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Arkansas, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the United States State Department, all great partners. And in the state of Arizona, Arizona Department of Public Safety, Department of Homeland Security, and the Arizona AG's office. The Marshall Islands played a very significant role too in this investigation. The Marshall Islands Attorney General's office, their national police, and the Majuro Sheriff's Office. And at this point now, I want to bring Dan Strong up to describe the charges that the defendant now faces in Utah, but I will note that he faces charges in Utah, Arkansas, and Arizona related to his illegal adoption scheme. Again, the lead prosecutor for our secure strike force, Mr. Daniel Strong.
Thank you, General. The announcement of charges today represents the culmination of a months-long investigation that was coordinated from our office through the secure unit. It involved prosecutors, a team of prosecutors, investigators, and staff, all working very hard on a large and complex, as you can see, very large-scale scheme. The result of all that effort are the following charges, if you can go to the charges. The defendant in Utah faces 11 counts, a mix of second and third degree felonies, human smuggling, sale of a child, communications fraud, and finally pattern of unlawful activity. And that last statute really encompasses the entire scope and scale of the operation, including all 40 of the identified victims we've mentioned earlier. I want to emphasize that the full story behind these charges will be told in court. That's the place for that. That's where we'll hear from witnesses and hear the bulk of the evidence that we've provided. With that said, today we're announcing charges, and we've provided a PC statement that reflects some of the evidence behind those charges. So you'll have those documents to review, and I think a big important piece of this is getting that information out to the public so that they can know that this has been going on, that hopefully we put a stop to it today, and that we can continue to collect additional evidence from anyone who's aware of aspects of this scheme. I really want to thank a few people for getting us to this point. First of all, the legislature for the state of Utah, which created the unit I work under, Secure, with the goal of targeting these types of large-scale operations, things like human trafficking, human smuggling, firearms trafficking. We have a special unit devoted to these large-scale cases, especially those involving immigration, and a team of investigators and prosecutors to look into those. Having worked in smaller jurisdictions in the past, I can say that this type of case would not be possible without that sort of devoted unit that has those sorts of resources to try to dig into something this large. So thank you to the legislature for that. I do, of course, want to thank our team of investigators and prosecutors who all, like I said, work together under Spence Austin, our criminal deputy, and also the agencies in the other states that have been mentioned. Cooperation with other jurisdictions, it may not be a surprise to hear, it can often be difficult and tricky. Sometimes it hurts a case. In this case, it helped. Early on, when we identified that there were aspects of this in Arizona and Arkansas, we reached out to them. We all made the decision to proceed jointly together to announce charges at the same time. Our charges were filed under seal last week, but we unveiled today when all 3 states were ready to go. We think that the cooperation in this case really strengthened each individual jurisdiction's work rather than harming or hindering it in any way. So I really want to thank everyone for that cooperation, which can be difficult. Of course, we want to thank the victims of the scheme who came forward and who are still coming forward to tell us their stories. Again, we are treating and thinking of the birth mothers in this case and the adopted families on the other end and the children involved as victims. We're not investigating them for any behavior, and so we do want to hear from them. We have heard from them. They've come forward with strength, bravery, and honesty, and without that, we would not be able to have brought charges in this case today. Finally, most importantly, perhaps, I want to thank the concerned Utahns out there who reported this. As General Reyes mentioned, this case started with a call to our human trafficking tip line. I've been doing trafficking cases for a while and related cases. I go out there all the time and we pound the drum. We say, if you see something, say something. If you see something suspicious, report it. This case really stands for the proposition that if you do see something, if you do say something, we're here to listen, we're here to help. We're here to bring to bear a great deal of resources and connections within our state, other states, and even across the globe to try to put a stop to this sort of terrible criminal behavior. And hopefully that we've taken a step toward doing that today. So that's about all I have to say. I'll turn it over to Chief Investigator Leah Lucy to talk more about the investigation.
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon. I'm going to speak to some of the unique dynamics of this case from the investigative perspective, as well as the resources that were brought forward, which have been alluded to, and a few other groups and entities we need to thank. As this case came in through our tip line Insecure, we have specifically trained investigators that are well-versed and knowledgeable in investigations of human trafficking and other associated crimes. The other major advantage that Strike Force has is that we have prosecutors that are also very attuned and adept, educated to and experienced in prosecuting those crimes. This case was unique in that it was a large-scale adoption fraud scheme. That I can speak from the investigative standpoint. We didn't have a lot of specialized training in. So a lot of education went on early. A lot of that came to the investigators through the prosecutors, through their knowledge, through their interpretation of the statutes and the laws. Without that, this case never would have moved. It took 18 months, as you can see approximately. It could have taken twice that. Without that embedded model of the prosecutors being able to serve in an advisory role and to guide investigators as to the legality and the types of charges that we want to look into and pursue. The Attorney General was gracious enough to give us the resources we needed. At one point in this investigation, we sent a prosecutor and 2 investigators to the Marshall Islands to conduct interviews, work with the Marshall Islands Attorney General's office as well as other government entities to make sure that we were on the right track and we understood the impact on the Marshall Islands and how that translated to the case. I'm going to address some of the phone calls that have been coming in since late last night, since the news broke on this case. We've received over 30 phone calls, probably more as of right now, but 30 phone calls last I heard, many of those from potential victims that we had not identified. Many of those from the state of Utah, several from outside the state of Utah. As has been alluded to, we have the hotline in place. That is being answered by 2 criminal investigators and a Marshallese interpreter handling those calls this morning. Those calls will most likely result in further investigations, further criminal screenings, and additional criminal charges. Time will tell. That's going on as we speak. We have had several calls this morning from victims that are asking about restitution in this case. People that have put down $20,000, $25,000 as a deposit towards pending adoptions to take place in the near future. We are doing all we can at this time to preserve all the assets that we can of Mr. Peterson and to eventually forfeit those assets to hopefully make the victims as whole as we can in this case. That is additional work that will be going on today and into the future between our investigators and prosecutors, and we are informed the other states and federal agencies are trying to do the same thing in their locales. The hotline will stay in place probably for a week or more. As long as calls are coming in, we will continue to man that hotline, and that's 24 hours a day, much to the chagrin of our investigators. This case is very complex. The resources, the intensity of the case, the sensitivity of the case. You have victims on the adoptive family side, you have victims on the birth mother side, have created a situation where with the lack of cooperation between all these states and agencies, we never would be standing here in front of you today. We couldn't agree with the prosecutors more that for that cooperation, the communication, partnerships, and building those relationships, this case is far stronger today than it would have been had we all proceeded separately. A few other people and entities we need to thank. I want to thank all of the hospitals and medical personnel that have been reaching out over the last 18 months to report the concerns, the observations they had, to identify potential victims. They've been critical in our investigation and bringing this case forward. I want to thank the various adoptive lawyers that have contacted us with concerns about how this was working. They came forward, they spoke on behalf of their clients and provided information that we were able to make contact and pursue as part of our case. I also want to especially recognize, and they're sitting behind you back there, our partners from the Asian Association of Utah. As the Attorney General said, and our lead prosecutor, Dan Strong, said, we have services in place. That includes everything from the hotline to referrals for legal advice, for housing, for food, for transportation. There are young women in the state of Utah right now from the Marshall Islands that are due to deliver today and in the next few days and weeks going forward, and we want to provide them any kind of resource and support that we can. The way they can get to those resources and that support is through our tip line and through the Asian Association of Utah. Thank you.
Rich, before you come up, let me just add another word. Now, the Asian Association of Utah has rebranded a little bit, the Refugee Immigrant Center. It's the same organization. They're still the same amazing group, Shu Chen and his team. But we would encourage anyone who feels like they might be a victim to reach out, to us. And we want to also, just to reiterate what the chief said, thank the Asian Association and our other partners from the beginning of the case, not only having our prosecutors working with our investigators, but our victim advocate and all of our victim partners for their support. It's critical for us. That's how law enforcement should be done, and I think Chief said it very well. Just wanted to clarify and make sure that everyone knew. Refugee Immigrant Center, that's the Asian Association, and we sure appreciate them.
Okay, we've got time for questions, but before we do that, I'm going to bring Dan back up so that he can describe briefly the cultural dynamic that came into play here. I think that's important for you to know so that you have an understanding of how this thing happened and how so many women were tricked, essentially, into coming over.
Thank you, Rich. I don't claim to be an expert on Marshallese culture, and we do expect to elicit expert testimony at some point in this case on those dynamics. So I would direct you to perform your own research and ask those people who are experts about some of this, because there's a lot of information out there. But I can speak to kind of what we discovered in our case, in our charges, and the people we talked to. That adoption is viewed very differently in some of the Pacific Islands, and especially the Marshall Islands. In essence, it's more free. It's not thought of as much of a technical or legal process. It's more of a cultural, traditional process. And that leads to a vast cultural misunderstanding between the two nations. And it's not that in every one of these instances we think that women were intentionally misled in this way, but it is that there's a cultural misunderstanding that's fundamental to the dynamic between the two countries that was exploited here. And that cultural misunderstanding is essentially codified in the compact. The compact was drafted specifically because there was such a long history of these problems, and they sought to prevent adoptions from happening this way. So if you wanted to do an adoption in the Marshall Islands the right way, you would go through the central adoption authority there, and that's what the compact, in our view, is intended to codify to make sure that that happens, and that's what did not happen here.
Okay, do we have questions?
Yeah.
Please specify who you want to talk to.
General Reyes or you. Basically, Utah's adoption laws are notoriously vicious in the fact that when an adoption is finalized, that's it. There's no unwinding the bell. But will you be trying to do that for any of these cases, including the ones currently in process?
I'll say first, Ben, again, I'm going to reiterate what we said earlier. We don't have any interest in unwinding or interfering with adoptions that have taken place. And it won't be our decision, but we will try to support the victims in the process in terms of cases that are currently pending. We are not in the business of making those ultimate policy decisions. There'll be courts there would be agencies that can address that.
We focused on the immigration dynamic here, so our investigation, our prosecution is focused on the moment when people were brought into this country and misrepresentations made along that path. The adoptions that happened later, we haven't focused on that. We haven't seen any reason to doubt the legitimacy of those adoptions. Some of the witnesses in this case were adoptive couples who have cooperated, who we feel were victimized. But I can say in our review, we don't anticipate adoptions being overturned, and we're not seeking to overturn any. And in prior cases, and there are a few prior cases like this, we haven't seen that type of fallout. So,
How many are we talking about, though? Do you have a ballpark of how many adoptions are in process right now?
do you want to answer that, Leo? I don't know if we can speak to that.
We don't have a specific number. We do know, because we've received calls through the night and up to the time of this press conference, that there are adoptions that are pending, and those people are very concerned and are reaching out. Again, we refer them to that tip line, and we will get them guidance to legal advice if they need that, or services, and any other type of resource they need that we can help take care of them and their child.
Other scams basically say that, well, they lie to the mom saying, you can get your kid back, where any of the biological mothers in this case told, you can get your kid back. This is just for hospital payments and all that kind of stuff.
I think we'll leave that type of evidence to be presented, as I said, in the day of court. I mean, you can look at the PC statement we provided. It has a few of the misrepresentations here, but really, the compact itself, in our view, has kind of rendered that issue less relevant, because it's intended to prevent us from ever having to get to that point that they've barred the travel here for adoption because of those misunderstandings. And again, I'll leave it to the ultimate fact finder to determine if that's what happened here in each case.
This is where it gets tricky, though. I mean, you say you're looking out for the biological moms and the adoptive families, and you have to worry about the concerns for all of them. But if that's the case, how do you not unwind the adoption if you need to look out for the biological mother's needs?
Well, it's a complicated set of facts. It's a complicated issue, and again, we're focused on the criminal violations. We're really focused on trying to put a stop to this before it goes any further. So we brought to bear the evidence and the charges we could file now. You know, there may with any operation of this size, a lot of people are affected, and things will have to be worked out in the future. I will say the charges that were filed today are more along the lines of women being offered money to come here, not necessarily being lied to about getting their children back. Again, that's more of a cultural misunderstanding that may have been present in their minds, but the evidence we've submitted today is more about the offers that were made of payment to induce adoptions, which is illegal.
You had 40 adoptions here, or women brought here to the state of Utah. Do you know how many in total, Arkansas, Arizona, other states, how many adoptions were facilitated?
I don't have those figures. I believe that Utah was the most substantial number, at least in the last few years, but I know there's a good deal of activity in Arkansas. There's a huge Marshallese population there, and Arizona is more the base of operations for this defendant. That's where he lives. So there's, I think, a smaller number of adoptions happening there, but still quite a few.
This is for Reyes. How did the adoptive parents get connected with this agency? Do we know?
How did they get connected with Mr. Peterson's
Yes.
agency? I think we have some of those facts that will come out again in trial, but I don't know in each case how they were initially contacted, whether it was proactive outreach to the adoptive parents or whether they had heard about the agency's services. So
None of the victims have said, because I know some have come forward about how they got in touch with Mr. Peterson.
some have shared some information, and the chief can talk about the limited amount that we're able to disclose at this point.
Thanks, John. So various ways. So you had recruiters on the ground in the Marshall Islands that were working with this organization. You had word of mouth by past adopted families. You had individuals in the Marshall Islands that have been involved or taken advantage of multiple times. So it occurred through all those things. Mr. Peterson had a pretty active advertising website for his business. So I would say they were referred or got connected through all those things.
Thank you.
Were some, any, all of the Marshallese women paid?
I'm certainly not going to say all. I would say some. Whether they were paid what they were offered, that's a whole other story that'll come up in trial. But certainly they were all offered some inducement.
So if I understand this correctly, that the artifice of the scheme works is because of the international compacts and how they're structured between the United States and the Marshall Islands, these women who entered into these agreements and were brought here to Utah knew that they would be giving up their children for adoption. They were fully on board, they waived their rights, and the adoption proceedings went forward. However, where it is illegal is to offer money to provide these costs. Just so you can clarify the nature of the compact.
Two different charges kind of overlapping there. So it is illegal in any case to bring someone from the Marshall Islands to the United States for the purpose of adoption. That's the human smuggling charge, essentially. So regardless of whether they're being offered payment
Without going through the Marshallese.
Right. So you can get under the immigration scheme, you can get a special visa to come here for adoption if one was granted. But the visa-free travel that you can typically do from the Marshall Islands is barred for adoption purposes.
You got to go through the Marshallese government first if you want to.
Right, essentially, yeah. So most Marshallese people can just come here with a passport. If you want an adoption, though, that puts you outside of that exception to immigration. And so someone who's bringing people here, knowing that they are coming for the purpose of adoption, would essentially be transporting someone here illegally. So that's the human smuggling part. Then in any case, you can check the sale of a child statute in Utah, but it's unlawful to offer any payment or anything of value with the purpose of inducing someone to place their child for adoption, and that's the money part of it.
What's the potential penalties if convicted? Is this a life top?
No, we're talking about second and third degree felonies. So second degree felony is a 1 to 15 year prison sentence is the maximum penalty there, and for third degree felonies, a 0 to 5 year prison sentence. And of course, the other states will also have different penalties as well.
Do you know why, if he's based in Arizona, why come to Utah? What was the tie there that brought him here to Utah?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure we all really know either. There's been some reference already today that to the adoption regulations here perhaps being more lax than in other states. And that's something we may be looking at with our legislature in the future if there's a way to tighten that up.
I will say Utah has a decent-sized Marshallese population, as does Arkansas. So he's probably, again, we're speculating, targeting neighboring states or states that have potential victims for him to exploit.
So what took him to the Marshall Islands then? What was his connection there?
He served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to the Marshall Islands.
Does it factor at all how, like, if the families wanted the adoption to happen, like, are you considering that at all, or is that kind of irrelevant based on what's legal?
Somewhat irrelevant in terms of what we're prosecuting under, at least some of the statute. The families understood that they would be giving the child up for adoption. Again, there's exploitation on a number of levels. I think Dan explained it well. I'll give a personal example, again, because of my Pacific Island cultural background. In the islands, my own grandmother, who was the second of 15 children, was allowed to go live with her grandparents on the Big Island in a somewhat more remote area for a number of years. I think it was about 10 or 11 years. She went away to help care for her grandfather, who was on his own by himself after her grandmother had passed away. It's a common, accepted, almost an honor to be able to help support other family members or even close friends who may not be blood relatives. And I think there is that sense, if you have any familiarity with the Pacific Island nations and people, and that they're doing something good for the community, for themselves, for the child, who I believe some of the witnesses or some of those that we interviewed felt like their children could grow up being healthy and strong here in the United States, with the understanding, again, we're not making any blanket statement, but I believe that the understanding of many of them was the children would come back. They were still part of their family, but this was similar to other kind of manifestations of this, broader family approach. And knowing that, understanding that, exploiting that for commercial gain, again, like I said, commoditization of children was the reason why we felt so strongly about this and put so many resources into the investigation and now the prosecution of this case.
At what stage did these women come from the Marshall Islands in their pregnancy to Utah, and under what conditions?
That's a good question, Dennis.
Under what conditions
You
did
know,
they
Chief,
live
in terms of
in
some
West
earlier,
Valley?
some later, but
So the question, just repeat it for me. one
So,
more time.
at what stage in their pregnancy were they brought here to Utah, and under what conditions did they live in this home in West Valley City?
Okay. The condition, they were carrying children, pregnant. At the time, most of them came within a few months to a few weeks to a few days of delivery time, so late in their pregnancy. As far as how and where they were being housed, there were multiple places stretching from Cache County up in Logan to West Valley, multiple places over the 3-year period we looked at. There were multiple women, anywhere from 3 to 10, staying in any given place at a time. And there were caretakers that were involved.
Are any of the women stranded in Utah trying to get back?
We will find that out from the calls that we're receiving now.
Any charges against the caretakers? Are they caretakers? You said that there were caretakers with these women in these crash houses. Are they co-conspirators?
Yeah, so it's still under investigation as far as that goes. Some aspects of this are ongoing. The other states did include some facilitators, but at this point we're still looking into that part of it.
So were they employed by Peterson then? Did he pay them to be caretakers?
Again, it's not part of the charge we filed today, so I can't really speak to that.
Do you think Peterson looked at himself in the mirror in the morning and thought he was doing good? Or what is your assessment from what this was all related to?
I'd be speculating. It's a mystery to me how anyone could do this and what they would think about it for themselves, so I don't want to speculate.
I just wanted to make sure, because we talked about some of the nuance involved with the islands and just what was going on here. Maybe some of the women thought they were helping. Can you kind of unequivocally, in the eyes of the law, just tell me what your opinion of all this is? I know it's kind of a broad, silly question, but
I try not to be in the business of operating those types of things. We're going to present the facts and the evidence in court, and we believe it meets the elements of the offenses we've charged, and therefore crimes were committed. Sorry for the boring answer, but that's what I'll give you.
And do you expect more people to be prosecuted?
sorry, let's go ahead.
Do you expect more people to be prosecuted?
Still investigating that. It's a possibility. And again, in response, I mean, unequivocally, we feel strongly about this case, or we wouldn't have filed it. We believe we have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to prove our case. So we're looking forward to our day in court, and want to emphasize that Mr. Peterson is entitled to presumption of innocence at this point. The people have vested in us a great deal of power. We understand that. This team behind me, these investigators, these prosecutors, these are amazing public servants. They take their jobs very seriously. They're careful. They're professional. They take the time and the care that is needed to put a complex case like this together as quickly as they can, because they know that these are important issues that affect deeply a lot of families. But they do it incredibly well. They're dedicated to seeing justice done, and we're looking forward to that opportunity. Ben, yeah.
So what's the difference between human smuggling, human trafficking?
Well, smuggling is a form of trafficking, as you know, Ben, but not every human trafficking case involves smuggling. In fact, what we're charging him under smuggling, that comes under the human trafficking code under Utah law. So again, to be clear, it's a human trafficking case. It's a human smuggling case. We don't always charge under the human trafficking statutes. Often that's for the best interest of the victims. We don't want to re-victimize the victims. If we can avoid putting a victim back on the stand and re-traumatizing them, but still get the result that we hope for, then we'll do that. You've seen that in other cases where we might file under white-collar statutes instead. And here, the elements fit the facts the best for smuggling, but it's a great question. Thanks for that question, Ben.
With Peterson's business, were all of his adoptions illegal in this matter, or did he have legal adoptions as well that you're aware of?
Again, I guess I'd be speculating a little bit. The ones we looked into all fit this scheme. There could be others.
Can you confirm in West Valley City the address where some of the birth mothers was staying is 3378 West Florida Ave? It's referred to as the Florida Ave house in court documents.
Yeah, we'll just refer to the probable cause statement. I think we put as much as we could in there.
What is the status of extradition for him? Because he was arrested, I think, in California or Arizona, and who gets him first? How does this work?
He was actually arrested in Arizona last night on his way back from California. He was booked into the Maricopa County Jail. He had the warrants executed from the state of Utah, the state of Arkansas, and then the federal warrant on the state of Arizona, and then the federal warrant out of Arkansas. There were bells set on the Utah charges and the Arizona charges. I'll let Dan speak to the way the federal hold would work, but he's, as at least the last word we had, he was being held and had not been released.
How much money do you think that he made from this scheme altogether?
Again, I think some of those details are in the probable cause statement, but on his own website, he charges $40,000 per adoption. That's what he lists, so you can look that up and kind of extrapolate from the number, I guess.
The number that's in there, I think it's like 2.6 million.
Yeah,
was that all from this scheme, or was it?
I think it was, if I can refer to the probable cause statement language, that was the incoming amount into an account. Of course, there's expenses coming out of that account as well. The bulk of the incoming money appeared to be related to the adoptions. That's about as much as we can say on that.
I have to imagine the economy in the Marshall Islands is quite different. Was $10,000 a pretty huge incentive? Would this set up the mothers for a long time?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Can you talk a little bit more about how the money works? Like, did the families pay him $40,000 to adopt someone?
It varies a little bit with the different witnesses we'll call, and we're still hearing from some, but I believe there's an upfront fee and then a fee after delivery as well.
Will he remain in Arizona?
It's still being worked out, so it's going to get a little tricky when you have 3 states. The charges are active in all 3 states, so as far as which court process happens first or whether they happen simultaneously, it's going to depend on his attorney's positions, the judges in the various jurisdictions. I will say that one of these cases is federal, so it's possible that might take precedence before we get him here, but that's speculation as well.
Is that the Arkansas case?
Yes.
It's federal? Okay.
I know you said there's no interest in unwinding adoptions that have taken place, but will there be any sort of reconnection between the adopted children and their biological parents?
It's say yeah. Again, it's kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing. There has been communication between those parties in a lot of these cases. They're open adoption, so it's not that they have no knowledge of each other in every case. But again, there's a lot of cases involved, so I don't want to speak too broadly.
Can I speak with the Attorney General, just the audacity of being an elected official and carrying out a scheme like this? I mean, just what the psychology of that is what's baffling to me, and that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about.
I'm going to repeat. Assessor Peterson is entitled to a presumption of innocence, so I can't make any final judgment. If we're able to prove our case, then I will say it will be extremely disappointing, I'm sure, for the people of Arizona and for those of us who also hold public office. We understand that those of us in public office are held to a higher standard. We ought to be. And we know that the people vest, as I mentioned before, an incredible amount of trust. But his position as a public elected official really doesn't bear in terms of much consideration as far as the charges that we brought in our case. So we'll leave the state of Arizona to deal with that issue and look into his position and whether he used it or abused it in any way. So again, beyond our case, we don't really want to venture into too much speculation there.
We're gonna cut this off now, but before we depart, our chief criminal deputy would like to speak. If you have any other questions, then we can handle them individually.
As you heard a few minutes ago, there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done in this case. And Utah took the lead in this investigation and then worked with Arizona and Arkansas going forward. But I want to recognize a couple of people who are standing before you who have had a lot to do with that. To my left, in the back here, is Craig Barlow, who you may know, been with the state for an awfully long time. He is the Division Director of the Justice Division under whom all of this took place. To his right is Janice McConis. She's a Section Director of Special Prosecutions and has been involved in the day-to-day of how this has gone forward in all the meetings that have taken place. And I just want to personally thank the Attorney General for his commitment to human trafficking and human smuggling, because without him, none of this would have happened. Thank you.